Thank you. My name is Jack Cole. I'm here because I served 26 years in the New Jersey State Police. I retired a detective lieutenant from that organization, and for 14 of those years I worked undercover in narcotics. Nothing I did in that entire 26 years reduced drug abuse in the world by so much as one human being. After I retired from that organization, I felt very bad about my part in implementing what today I feel is not only a failed war on drugs, but it's far worse. It's a self-perpetuating, constantly expanding policy disaster. So I sat down with 4 other police officers and we created this organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP. And the way we came to create it was the first thing we said to ourselves was, what should law enforcement really be interested in doing? And when we boiled it down to the essence, we decided that we should be interested in reducing 4 things: death, disease, crime, and addiction. And sadly, folks, as I'm sure you know, all 4 of those categories are just made infinitely worse by the war on drugs. So that definitely wasn't what we wanted. What we decided we did want, after much study, is reflected in our name, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We want to end drug prohibition around the world, just like we ended alcohol prohibition in the United States in 1933. Because looking at this from the viewpoint of law enforcement, we understand the day after we ended that terrible law, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing us cops charged with fighting that useless war. And they were no longer killing our children caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings, all the things we experience today. So we know if we legalize these drugs, we can take them out of the hands of the criminals and end the violence. And then when we regulate the drugs, we can do some other wonderful things. We can end overdose deaths. In my experience in that 14 years living in the streets with those folks, I can tell you nobody dies from an overdose because they inject more and more drugs. They die because they don't know how much of that tiny package of powder they're buying is really the drug and how much is the cutting agent. Too much drug, you're dead. And in an illegal, unregulated market, they will never know what's in that package. We can prevent 50% of all new cases of these horrible blood-borne diseases, HIV, AIDS, hepatitis C. According to our Center for Disease Control in my country, they say that 50% of all new cases can be traced directly back to drug users sharing needles. And if the drugs were legal, they wouldn't have to do that. And then when we start treating drug abuse as a health problem instead of a crime problem, we can actually help these millions of young people whose lives were destroyed through arrest and imprisonment and sacrificing on this altar of the drug war. We can bring them back into society. The first time I saw Marco was 2002. I got invited to Tirana, Albania for that Congress. And at that time, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition had less than 50 people. Now we've got over 50,000 police, judges, prosecutors, prison officials, federal agents in 86 countries. All we are is a speakers bureau. And we have over 150 speakers. Anybody can join LEAP, and I would ask that everybody join it. But to be a speaker, you have to be a current or former drug warrior. You have to actually have worked on the drug laws. That's the way we keep our credibility. And because of that credibility, in the last 10 years, we've given over 8,000 presentations around the world in 24 countries so far. And we have the effect of convincing 80% of our audience no matter where we go because of that credibility. So I'm going to give you a little taste of what it's like, what our talks are like. And these are talks that when we go out, we don't go and talk to a bunch of people that want to use drugs. We talk to civic, professional organizations, religious and educational organizations. These are pretty conservative folks. And these are the people that I'm saying 80% of them agree with us when we get done. It was 1964 when I joined the New Jersey State Police. That picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of when I graduated that year. And right underneath it is more or less a picture of when I graduated from their narcotic bureau. Actually, that's one of the better pictures. We try and keep the bad ones off of there. It was 1970 when I went into narcotics. 1970 was the beginning of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was actually coined and created by Richard Milhous Nixon in 1968, and like all other things that pertaining to drugs, it had almost nothing to do with a drug problem. It had everything to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency of the United States for the second time, and he thought this time it'd really be nice if he could win. He knew if he was a strong anti-crime person, it would give him a lot of votes, but boy, if he could be in charge of a war on drugs, how those votes would pour in. And he was right, he was elected. By the way, these other pictures, just pictures of me in different undercover poses up there. When he was elected, he got the U.S. Congress to pass massive funding bills that would give tremendous amounts of money to any police department willing to fight his war on drugs. And the way he set it up, this became a numbers game for law enforcement. Because the more arrests any department makes, the more money they get from the federal government the following year. So it's a pay-as-you-go type thing. And we were literally off to the races. And we never should have been, because the drug problem that we had in 1970 was really not very much. What little problem we had was mainly soft drugs, drugs like cannabis, hashish. Hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine were virtually unheard of in 1970. Certainly unheard of compared to what they are today. Let me just summarize what we've done by showing you 7 things that should have occurred if the drug war were actually working. And then we'll break them down and tell you the truth about each one. First, the drug supply is supposed to decrease if the war is working. Second, the drug purity is supposed to decrease. And if those 2 things happen, then the law of supply and demand says that drug prices should increase. And of course, if those 3 things happen, then drug use is supposed to decrease. Number 5, drug overdose deaths will then decrease. Number 6, drug prohibition murders will decrease. And eventually, of course, drug violation arrests will decrease, because you got them all. You already arrested everybody, right? In actuality, every one of those things, exactly the opposite has happened of what they expected. Drug supply should decrease, the first one. The simplest way to get an idea in your mind about how much drugs are being supplied to any country is to see how seizures have increased or decreased over the years. And for the United States, When we started the war on drugs, the largest drug seizures at the beginning of that war were measured in pounds. Today they're measured in tons. 10 tons of heroin, one seizure in the United States. 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure in the United States. 186 tons of marijuana, one seizure in the United States. Now you'd think if that's going on, certainly the purity level of the hard drugs would be dropping because there wouldn't be enough drugs to go around. Again, that's not so. Actually, when I started buying heroin on the streets in New Jersey, undercover, the average package that I would buy was coming in at 1.5% heroin. All the rest was cutting agent. 40 years later, DEA tells us the average street level heroin is coming in at 60% pure. That's a problem 40 times greater than it was at the beginning of the war. Number 3, drug prices should increase. Well, actually, they've decreased quite a lot. According to DEA, wholesale price for cocaine has dropped 60% since the beginning of the war, and the wholesale price for heroin is down 70% since the beginning of the war. Drug use should decrease. Again, according to DEA, they estimate that when we started that war, we had about 4 million people in the United States above the age of 12 who had ever used an illegal drug. I plugged that into that possible population for my country back then, and that was 2% of the population. Today, they tell us we have 112 million people in the country above the age of 12 who used an illegal drug. Folks, that's 46% of our population. 23 times as great as it was at the beginning of the war, and we got there through this war on drugs. Number 5, heroin overdose deaths, or all hard drug overdose deaths, should decrease, but in truth they've increased significantly. From the time we started the war until about 1979, we were experiencing 28 heroin overdose deaths per 100,000 heroin users. Today we experience 141 deaths per 100,000 heroin users. That's a 5-fold increase. Something's wrong here. We're going the wrong direction. Number 6, drug prohibition murders should decrease. Now you notice I call those drug prohibition murders, not drug-related murders, which is the way you read about them in the newspaper. They are not drug-related. They are drug prohibition murders. They don't exist because someone got high on drugs and went out and killed somebody. During alcohol prohibition, when we had the the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and back then a massacre was considered 7 people, the people that Al Capone sent to murder those people weren't high on alcohol. They were just conducting business. And the people who have killed tens of thousands, murdered tens of thousands of people in Mexico, Venezuela, all through Central and South America, weren't high on drugs when they did it. This is just the way you conduct business in order to control the market under prohibition.